Texas, the United States of America. The Lone Star State, the largest state by landmass within the lower 48. Many people think of a variety of different things when you say Texas. Huge state fairs, sprawling desert and forests, diverse culture and wildlife, maybe even the Battle of the Alamo and the Mexican-American War. However, to the 29 million people who live here, it is simply home. But within this endless expanse of farmland, metro areas, and dry, arid heat, there are stories of the supernatural and the unexplained, things that go bump in the night, and monsters that defy conventional explanation. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we revisit our Cryptids Across America series by traveling to the great state of Texas to examine some of the more obscure stories and legends of monsters to come from the state. This is Cryptids Across America, number 3, Texas. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. I am your host, Dominic, and if you just listened right through that intro, I have some new intro music. Please let me know if you like it or not, if you think it is an upgrade from the previous music I had. I certainly think it is, and I hope you all like it as much as I do. However, that won't be the only change for this week's episode and going forward. Usually at the end, if you listen all the way to the end of my episodes, I do my mandatory plugs about where you're listening to this and all that. I've decided to change that up and throw that to the beginning, so I'm going to do it very, very quickly, and then we're going to dive into today's episode. If you're listening to this episode on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out within the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. Please visit me on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown. I'm also on TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown. Feel free to send me topic suggestions as well to my email, also at Unblurring the Unknown, and also to Instagram direct message. Now, with that being said, today I've decided to venture back into our Cryptids Across America series. Now, it has been quite some time since we have done one of these episodes, and I felt like it was only a matter of time before we circled back and did one of these for an episode. Now, as someone who has been to Texas numerous times, I can only say positive things about it. The culture, the people, and the landmarks are nothing short of amazing, and I thoroughly recommend a trip to San Antonio to see the Alamo as well as the Riverwalk. Anyone from that area knows how cool it is, and personally, again, I found it very fascinating, very cool, and it has been a few years since I've gone myself, but I remember my trips to Texas very, very fondly. But with that all being said, I'm kind of getting off topic here. But Texas has a very rich history of the supernatural, the paranormal, and kind of these monster stories, which makes it a very worthy contender for today's episode. Now, when you do think about Texas and cryptids and monsters, your brain will probably instantly go to the chupacabra, which I think is where everyone's mind would naturally go. Now, because of that, I have actually decided to omit the chupacabra from today's episode in favor of some more obscure stories of monsters and legends that not everyone has heard of. Now, I want to bring some awareness to those monsters that might be a little lesser known to the general population. And with that being said, I will most likely circle back and cover a whole episode on the chupacabra at some point. So again, another reason why I decided to omit it from today's episode. Now, if you've listened to one of these episodes before, you probably know the drill here. But for those of you who have not, let me give you a little rundown on how today's episode is going to work. Now, the cryptids that we're going to be diving in today are the Houston Batman, the Lake Worth Monster, and the Wampus Cat. A plethora of different kinds of creatures for today's episode, and we are going to first explore the Houston Batman. Now, the Houston Batman, bearing no resemblance to the DC Comics character, is a flying, biped, human-like creature that bears a lot of similarities to West Virginia's Mothman, which many people probably have heard of at some point in time if you were in tune with the cryptid world. The origin of the Houston Batman, and really the only verified sighting I could find, comes from June 18th, 1953, in the Houston suburbs. Now, keep in mind, this sighting of the Houston Batman would take place roughly 13 years before the infamous Mothman sightings, which I feel is worth noting. Hilda Walker, 23, was sitting on her front porch and visiting with some of her nearby neighbors, one being 14-year-old Judy Meyer and 33-year-old Howard Phillips. It was roughly 2:30 a.m., which seems awfully late to be up in my opinion, but to each their own. As the three were sitting and chatting, something caught their attention approximately 25 feet away in the distance. The three people sitting there on the porch saw a large shadow move across the lawn in front of them. Originally thinking that this could have been a large moth's reflection caught in one of the nearby streetlights, Walker, Meyer, and Phillips didn't think too much of it until they watched the shadow jump upwards and move kind of unnaturally. And when it did this, this is when they would observe this creature that was no moth. The three described the shadow almost jumping upwards into a nearby pecan tree, and when they looked to see what it was, the three were astonished about what they were seeing. What was in this pecan tree looked like a human, roughly 6.5 feet tall, all black in color, or wearing some type of gray or all black suit, with large bat-like wings. As the creature seemed to linger on that tree for roughly 30 seconds, they also observed a halo of light, or a halo-like light, seemingly emitting from the creature. Walker, Meyer, and Phillips were frozen in their tracks on the front porch, seemingly in fear, not knowing what they were looking at. After this 30 seconds or so elapsed, the figure seemed to disappear from the tree, and this light that the creature was emitting seemed to dwindle and fade away. Once the creature was seemingly gone, the young Judy Meyer let out a loud scream, seemingly now able to react to the figure's presence. Right after seeing the figure, Walker stated, and I quote, "We heard a loud swoosh over the housetops across the street. It was like the white flash of a torpedo-shaped object. I've heard so much about flying saucer stories, I thought all those people telling the stories were crazy, but now I don't know what to believe. I may be nuts, but I saw it, whatever it was. I sat there, stupefied. I was amazed." All three of the witnesses stated that they saw this flash or streak of light, whether it came from the creature itself or perhaps something else. They didn't see that night. This all remains unexplained. They don't know if this light came from this creature. They don't know if the light came from something else. They couldn't really explain it. They couldn't explain this whole situation. They couldn't explain this whole sighting because this flies in the face of what really conventional science tells you, the idea of a humanoid all-black figure with bat-like wings that's flying through the air. That can't be real. Of course, they didn't think so until that night came and passed. The following morning, Hilda Walker would file a police report, and the Houston Chronicle would go on to conduct interviews with Walker, Meyer, and Phillips in the days that followed. Now, this is where the story ends for the time being. And there's only this one sighting in 1953, and nothing else to go on until some point in the 1990s, when staff at the Bel Air Theater in Houston would see something on top of a roof of a building in Houston that can only be described as a giant helmeted man. Now, I tried to find more on this sighting, but couldn't find anything through some digging and Googling. Further investigations made into this sighting by cryptozoologist Ken Gerhard, a Houston native, found him not even being able to find the address where the sighting took place because of the expanse of Interstate 10 taking up where this sighting took place. And I'm referring to the original sighting in the Houston suburbs. Now, when I found myself researching this and doing some digging, what I started to think about was, of course, Mothman, as it is kind of virtually impossible for you to not think about Mothman when you hear a story like this. And I also thought about the Blackbird of Chernobyl, or maybe even a deeper bagpull with the Owlman of Cornwall, England. Now, I know when you start to talk about Mothman, in the superstitions that surround him, it is often associated that he, or she, appears like a premonition, like a precursor that something bad is about to happen. In the case of Mothman, it was the Silver Bridge collapse, and with the Blackbird of Chernobyl, both nearly identical in their descriptions, being cited just before, of course, the Blackbird of Chernobyl being cited just before the explosion of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Now, is there perhaps something more to this myth? Could it be possible that these creatures, these flying entities, whatever they might be, could they be omens of something awful about to happen? I wanted to see if this trend continued itself with the case of the Houston Batman. Now, when I started digging, I found that the only disaster that happened in the Houston area that would classify as something major, something more than just a car accident, of course, would take place in Houston, of course, and it would be an explosion that would take place at the Alco Fireworks Factory on June 5th, 1953, and it would claim the lives of 4 people. Now, unfortunately, this sighting of the Houston Batman would take place roughly 2 weeks after the incident at the Alco factory, which makes me skeptical. Now, you also have the Waco tornado outbreak of 1953 that would occur kind of in this same time period. However, that would take place over a 3-day period in early May, and Waco is almost 3 hours away from Houston, which, in my opinion, effectively eliminates itself as a contender for my hypothesis. And for that matter, I couldn't find anything else about any accidents or anything like that going on during this time period. Now, if we take the 1990s sighting by the Bel Air Theater staff with a grain of truth, the closest I could find to a major accident taking place around that time period would be a chemical plant explosion in Channelview, Texas, which is near Houston, but without this creature being spotted near this chemical plant or there being a definitive year for the Bel Air Theater sighting, we're kind of grasping at eggshells here. Now, to add fuel to the skeptical fire, ABC 13 Houston has been unsuccessful trying to get in touch with the original people who claimed the sighting, that being Hilda Walker, Judy Meyer, and Howard Phillips. In an article published back in 2018, they have had no luck. I don't know if they've had luck currently. However, that article, like I said, was published in 2018, and to that point, they had been unsuccessful in trying to locate them or kind of, find them to try and get a comment to kind of circle back on this story. So where does this leave us with theories about the Houston Batman? Now, you could call me a skeptic, you could call me maybe a buzzkill, I've used that word before. I honestly think this story was made up. And again, you could call me a party pooper, and like I said, maybe a buzzkill, but I think the lack of evidence here, and this being a one-off sighting, makes me think these 3 people were trying to figure out a way to make a quick buck or get in the news. I could possibly also see this as a misidentification of a natural animal, perhaps a black vulture or some other large black bird. I know you might hate me for shooting it down with being skeptical, but to me, the one-off sighting casts doubt on this whole story. The idea of lights in the sky was heavily popular just a few years prior throughout the late 1940s. Perhaps this could have been someone trying to take this story of the UFOs and strange lights in the sky one step farther. Who knows? In my opinion, there is just not enough evidence here to convince me otherwise. But with that being said, let's now move on to our second cryptid I'm going to cover today, the Lake Worth Monster. Now, when you hear the words lake and monster attached to each other, it usually means that we are dealing with something of the aquatic variety. However, in the case of the Lake Worth Monster, that would not be the case. The Lake Worth Monster, sometimes also referred to as the Greer Island Goatman. Witnesses described this monster as Bigfoot-esque, resembling that of some human goat-like crossbreed that walks on 2 legs and was covered in long, thick hair. It was between 6.5 to 7 feet tall and weighing roughly 350 pounds. Now, the focal point of the sightings involving the Lake Worth Monster took place in the hot and humid summer of 1969. Greer Island is a pretty large island located smack dab almost in the middle of Lake Worth, but it is not far from major roadways, and with it being right next to the city of Fort Worth, it makes it a very desirable spot to go and spend time and try and beat the summertime heat. Back during 1969, the area of Greer Island was easily accessible for the public, and this allowed teenagers and young couples to sneak away to. Now, from what I could find, the first documented sighting of the Lake Worth Monster would take place on July 9th, when a group of 3 couples were enjoying the peace by the lake late at night when they would be interrupted by a beast. At around midnight, they would hear a large thud crash down on the roof of their car. They observed this massive beast try to reach into the car and snatch up one of the girls inside the car. Before the monster was able to grab the girl, the witnesses were able to shake the beast from the roof of the car and speed off into the night. Now, at this point, the police had been receiving other reports about this supposed monster on Greer Island, but mostly laughed them off as pranks, and they didn't take them seriously. That would be until this July 9th sighting, when after further examination of the couple's car that night, an 18-inch long gash along the side of the car would be discovered, and this would spark intrigue that this could be something more than just a prank. Now, it would be just the following night when the Lake Worth monster would make another appearance. On July 10th, a couple dozen people were hanging out on a side of the lake known for dumping junk and household items. Among some of the people present were a couple of sheriff's deputies, and while everyone was there, the monster made another appearance. It appeared on a cliff nearby, and witnesses described the monster as looking extremely angry. It then picked up a tire, presumably discarded trash from somebody else, and proceeded to throw that tire a whopping 500 feet away. This was enough of a display for everyone who was there, including the sheriff's deputies, to turn around and run for the hills. Now, as word got out about this monster hanging around the lake, many people took it upon themselves to investigate the legitimacy of these claims, as well as those who felt the need they must try and kill the monster for everyone's safety. Many people went to the lake armed with rifles, trying to get a glimpse of the monster, quite possibly with the hopes they could either scare it off or even kill it. The police warned against the public doing this, as the influx of armed people descending on the lake could possibly lead to accidents, and I would agree with that. Other sightings would come in, and the legend would solidify itself in the region. Anyone who had heard screeching cries around the lake naturally attributed it to the Lake Worth monster. Some witnesses even say they watched the monster snap the limb of an oak tree like a toothpick, and others, like Alan Plaster, claimed to have taken a photo of the monster in November of 1969. Now, I do encourage everyone to go out there and take a look at this photo. If you just Google Lake Worth monster photograph, or maybe Lake Worth monster 1969 photograph, it should pop right up. Now, if you want my personal opinion on this photo, and if you take a look at it, it's kind of really hard to tell what's there. It's a close-up shot, and it does show a tall bipedal figure covered in thick white hair. But like I said, it's relatively close. You can't tell how tall it is, roughly, because there's nothing to use as a guide at all. And at this point, my tinfoil hat now comes on, or comes off, and makes me think this picture was faked. Now, I could be wrong, and again, you could be calling me a buzzkill, but with the lack of perspective in the photo and the lack of anything else in the photo, it doesn't really show you how tall it is. There's so much hair, or it's covered in so much hair, you can't really see any muscle definition or anything like that. You can't see any facial features because it actually has its back partially turned to the photo. So it just checks a lot of boxes for someone trying to make a hoax, or trying to make a hoax photo to try to go in the newspaper or something like that. The photo to me just looks fake. Again, I will let you all have your own personal opinions, but I do highly encourage you taking a look at the photo for yourself. Now, when it does come to theories, let's quickly discuss them. Now, our first one being that this is perhaps some Bigfoot-type relative, and the comments made about the goat-like resemblance could be because of the thick white hair. After all, this quote-unquote goat man seems distinctively different than that of other reported goat men throughout the United States. Take the goat man of the Old Alton Bridge, which is also in Texas, which has a goat man legend as well, which this goat man is described much more supernatural in nature and rooted in a legend and lore about this lynched black man in Denton, Texas, who after being murdered took on the form of a supernatural goat-man hybrid as revenge against those who murdered him. Obviously, a very stark contrast compared to the Lake Worth monster. Now, you also have the legend of the Pope Lick monster in Kentucky, again, mostly existing in the realm of myth rather than fact, but again, it is more of a goat or sheep man hybrid rather than a giant hairy creature. Bigfoot, in fact, is not a new idea in Texas. Texas has a huge swath of reports when it comes to Bigfoot, and instantly your mind has to go to the idea that perhaps this could be a Bigfoot that just has white hair, or maybe is suffering from some type of hair pigmentation issue, like it's albino, or maybe even piebald. Now, our second theory is that this is clearly some type of prank, and that it is clearly highlighted in the photo. In this theory, this whole thing is fake, this whole thing is staged, and the photo from Alan Plaster is a fake. I think that's a hoax, in my opinion. I don't think that there's anything there to sway my opinion of that, and that photo in particular is just a man in a Yeti costume or something like that to play on the idea that the beast has white hair. To be honest, about the Lake Worth monster, I'm kind of on the fence here. I would not be shocked if there were a couple true, genuine sightings of unexplained howls or sightings of the creature, but to say that for a fact this thing is real, I am just not sure. I think the lack of prolonged sightings past 1969 also makes me question the authenticity of this as well, but I would not be surprised if there were some other isolated sightings after the initial wave of 1969. However, I had a tough time trying to find them personally. I do think that there is some truth to this one. I think with the sighting when it pertains to the sheriff deputies that were there, the sighting where everybody was hanging out kind of by that dumping site, and then he appeared on a cliff and he threw a tire, 500 feet. I think there's some truth, and I think that when it comes to some sightings, I think a lot of them have a single kernel of truth that is sometimes engulfed by exaggeration, if that makes any sense. Do I think the Lake Worth monster could be real? I definitely think it is. I think when you dive deeper into the Bigfoot phenomenon, people have to be seeing something. There is so many sightings and so many regional variations of Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you prefer to call it, that there has to be something. There would be impossible for it to not be something, or there would be just one thing to explain these thousands and thousands of sightings, and I just don't think that's the case. I think there needs to be something. However, as I've gotten older, I have become more skeptical. When I was a kid, I was fascinated by the Bigfoot legend. Many people close to me who maybe knew me in middle school knew that was the case, but I've kind of grown a lot more skeptical to the Bigfoot legend. However, I'm still on the fence, and on the fence here with the Lake Worth monster, that there needs to be some truth here, and I think there is some truth here. However, I think a majority of it is maybe exaggerated, but I do think there is something here, and there could be a monster at play. However, it is very, very hard to tell what that monster could be. Now, our last cryptid, let's talk about the Wampus Cat. Now, the Wampus Cat is not a legend that is central to Texas, as the legend itself has a footing in much of the Ozarks, the American South, and even spanning into the Carolinas, West Virginia, and other states in the Appalachian Mountains. The origins of the Wampus Cat seem to come from Native American folklore. The story supposedly has a couple different origins, both coming from Cherokee folklore. The first being the story of Running Deer, a Cherokee woman who wanted to take down the spirit of madness in Cherokee culture known as Ewa, and I hope I pronounced that right. Running Deer believed the spirit was responsible for causing her husband to go crazy, so she decided to take it upon herself to defeat the spirit. Embodying the spirit of the mountain cat, she defeated Awa and took on the role of spirit talker and home protector, and that of the Wampus Cat itself. Now, according to this legend, it is the spirit of Running Deer to this day, patrolling its land and protecting it from evil spirits, and that is what the Wampus Cat is. Now, there is another version of the legend which includes a Cherokee woman who was caught spying on a medicine man conducting a secret ritual by hiding under the pelt of a mountain lion. Now, this Cherokee woman would be caught by the medicine man, and as punishment, she was turned into the Wampus Cat. Now, whether or not you want to believe either of those legends, totally up to you. However, I do find them very fascinating. Now, fast forward to the very early 1900s. The Wampus Cat was a creature gaining notoriety across the southern United States and kind of entered the vicinity of what we would consider a fearsome critter. A creature mostly existing in myth that was influenced by campfire stories and things of that nature. Now, if you want to learn more about the fearsome critters, I highly encourage you to do so. I've done an episode, I would say probably Oh boy. 5 or 6 episodes ago, I did do my first episode of the Fearsome Critters. I do plan to have that be a recurring episode every, once in a while and revisit them. But I do highly encourage you, if you are into cryptids, but you're maybe not into the whole monster, scary, things like that, the Fearsome Critters are definitely something to get into because they're very kind of cool, quirky, maybe not so dangerous, and they're kind of just interesting. Now, while some areas of the Appalachian region of the United States claim to have actual sightings of the Wampus Cat, Texas's history with the Wampus Cat seems to start at the turn of the 1900s with a man named Don Hampton Biggers. Now, that is a rather precarious last name, so we are just going to refer to him by Don. Now, as it turns out, Don was a journalist and a historian that ran a newspaper. But, see, it was not your normal everyday newspaper, but rather a satirical one. I mean, you probably see those crazy magazines in the rack when you were at the checkout line at the grocery store by the name of Weekly World News. Now, 90s and 2000s babies know exactly what I'm talking about. So you could say that this was a 1900s version of that. Now, while he was writing this satirical newspaper that he called Billy Goat Always Button In, he would have a life change. He wanted to move, and he decided to move to the town of Abilene, Texas in 1907. Now, this is where Don would change course about his writing and start focusing on establishing a well-respected paper. However, this wouldn't mean that he would stop writing satire, but rather write it on the side, or perhaps include it in his newspaper as a way to fill some blank space week to week. Now, it would not take long for Don to start including a tale about the Wampus Cat, in which he affectionately describes as, and I quote, a cross between a wildcat, badger, and a lobo wolf, with fangs 2 inches long and claws that could peel the bark off of a mesquite tree. Now, many people who lived in this area of Texas knew the stories about the Wampus Cats were fake and mostly made up by Don in his newspaper. However, many visitors to the town in this region of Texas would hear about these stories, and since they didn't know any better and they didn't know that these stories were fake, they would leave town hoping that these fearsome felines were not real, and they definitely did not want to have an encounter with one. Now, many schools throughout Texas have embodied the legend of the Wampus Cat, adopting it as their mascot, as well as many schools across the country as well. Now, the name Wampus Cat itself is a play on words already available to us, most notably cattywampus, meaning peculiar or frightening. Now, it could have also taken influence by the name catamount, which is another name for a mountain lion. Now, as many of you know, or if you're regular listeners, I might have dropped hints to where I live. I, of course, live in New England, as, like I said, you regular listeners might know. So UVM, the University of Vermont, is known as the Catamounts, and it is not uncommon to hear mountain lions be referred to that, even though their existence in the state of Vermont and New England is hotly debated, but arguably non-existent currently, depending on which side of the argument you want to fall on. So what do I think about the Wampus Cat? Now, unfortunately, I think this falls within the category of fearsome critter, like I mentioned, and I think the legend itself obviously spread very far and very wide throughout the central and southern United States because of its ties to Native American folklore and things like that. However, there was little evidence to support, or little to no evidence, to support the existence of the Wampus Cat besides maybe a campfire story or it being mentioned in this newspaper. So unfortunately, I think this one could be chalked up to being nothing more than a tall tale made by people into a scary story of another apex predator possibly prowling the American South. But with that being said, that is the 3 cryptids I did this week for our Cryptids Across America episode 3 into Texas. I hope you all enjoyed it again. I did not want to cover the Chupacabra for obvious reasons. I wanted to circle back and do that as a full episode. I feel like there is plenty of content when it comes to the Chupacabra to cover it as a full episode. Of course, its roots in Texas legend and Texas lore, but also in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, their kind of legends around the Chupacabra as well that are vastly different from the Texas version. And I think that those are very by themselves, and I could cover them in a whole episode dedicated to the Chupacabra, so I do plan on revisiting that at another time. So don't stress if you are wanting to hear the Chupacabra the second I said Texas. I will come back to it, I promise you. And don't worry. I got you. It's on the list. It is on my master queue of topics, and I will eventually get to it. It seems like every week that list grows longer and longer and longer, and I am only able to do one at a time, so it kind of very limits me. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me today. It's kind of weird not doing all my plugs at the end, but I feel like it's better to address them all in the beginning. Again, that is going to do it for me this week on the third entry into our Cryptids Across America series. Again, I greatly appreciate the support, all of you. I do. I read pretty much all of your comments, and it seems like every day I'm checking my YouTube, checking my Spotify, looking at views, looking at comments, and trying to do the best that I can for all of you that listen, all of you that check out my content. And again, the support is greatly appreciated, and it goes without saying how much I appreciate it. I know I'm just a man talking into a microphone, but believe me, I appreciate it. I appreciate the support, and it means the world to me. But again, I'm dragging on. That's going to do it for me on this week. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the next one.